Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to the dimly lit corners of the past. I invite you to settle in, find a comfortable spot, and let your eyelids grow just a little heavier. The world outside can wait. For now, we'll wander quietly through history's peculiar hallways, the ones that smell faintly of candle wax, damp parchment, and poor personal hygiene. Our theme tonight is witches. Or rather, what people thought of witches before witch trials became the continent-wide spectator sport that they eventually were. Because contrary to what popular imagination suggests, medieval Europe did not spend every waking moment shrieking about broomsticks and black cats. In fact, for a very long time, witches weren't especially frightening at all. They were just inconvenient, sometimes useful, occasionally irritating, and sometimes merely an excuse for the neighbors to whisper. So let's drift back to late antiquity and the early medieval world, when the word witch was still wobbling a row. Around like a newborn foal, not yet burdened with centuries of screaming villagers and crackling bonfires, in a Roman world, magic was not entirely outlawed. People performed charms, cast little spells, and whispered over herbs. This was considered ordinary. Everyday magic, healing charms, love potions, curses scratched on thin sheets of lead, were less burn at the stake material and more mildly frowned upon if you got caught. The authorities only really cared if you aimed your sorcery at the emperor. Trying to hex a neighbor's fig tree was fine. Plotting mystical assassination of the emperor? Not fine. Because, of course, the empire had its priorities. When Christianity began spreading, things shifted. Church leaders had to decide whether magic was real or just pagan nonsense. The official stance, eventually, was that it was both real and nonsense, which is very convenient. It allowed bishops to dismiss charms as silly superstition, but also to condemn them as dangerous when needed. Like when someone was clearly making too much money selling love potions. In early medieval Europe, witches were less the terrifying figures of folklore and more the village oddballs. Picture an old woman who knew which weeds cured headaches. Someone who mumbled strange prayers over a cow to make it produce milk again. People might call her a witch, but often they meant it in the same way you might call someone eccentric. Suspicious, yes. Potentially unsettling. But also occasionally useful.
Because if your baby wouldn't stop crying, and the local wise woman said to tie a sprig of rue above the cradle, you did it. And when the baby slept, you nodded gravely, acknowledging her mysterious powers. If the baby didn't sleep, you at least had an herb dangling above the bed frame, which gave the impression that you'd tried. So, witches in this period weren't hunted in large numbers. They were lived with, tolerated, occasionally scolded by priests for clinging to superstitions, sometimes fined, sometimes ridiculed, but rarely executed. In fact, in many areas, killing a supposed witch was considered worse than practicing magic itself, because you deprived the community of a resource, however questionable, that. Let's drift gently over to Anglo-Saxon England. Their law codes mentioned witches, but not in the dramatic Hollywood sense. Laws of Alfred, for example, witches were grouped with things like fortune tellers and charm singers. Punishments existed, but they were generally fines or exile, not bonfires. To the Anglo-Saxon mind, witches were real enough to legislate against, but not terrifying enough to warrant mass hysteria. It's worth remembering that this was the same society where trial by hot iron, literally holding a burning chunk of metal to prove innocence, was an acceptable legal practice. And even in that environment, they still didn't feel witches required spectacular punishments. That tells you something. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, things had a slightly different flavor. The Norse were quite happy to believe in magic, and not always in a bad way. Seer, a form of sorcery, was sometimes practiced by men, though it carried a reputation for being unmanly. Women, however, were much freer to dabble. A vulva, or seeress, might be invited into a household to chant and drum herself into a trance. She would then deliver advice from the spirit world, possibly about whether it was a good time to sail west, and not always in a bad way. Seer, a form of sorcery, was sometimes practiced by men, though it carried a reputation for being unmanly. Women, however, were much freer to dabble. A vulva or seeress might be invited into a household to chant and drum herself into a trance. She would then deliver advice from the spirit world, possibly about whether it was a good time to sail west and bother the Irish again. So here again, witches, or at least women who practice magic, weren't automatically the enemy. They could be prestigious, desired, though sometimes feared and occasionally suspected of doing unspeakable things with goats, which, unfortunately, is a recurring theme in European imagination. Now, an important detail. For centuries, the Church's official stance was that witches were not real. That's right, not real. In 906, a church document called the Canon Episcopi declared that women who thought they were flying with the goddess Diana in the night sky were simply deluded, hallucinating, dreaming. These were not genuine flights on broomsticks, but tricks of the devil in the mind. And for hundreds of years, that was the official party line. If someone confessed to being a witch, the church would sigh and say, "No, dear, you didn't actually fly through the night. You had a silly dream. Please stop embarrassing yourself." So for much of the early Middle Ages, witchcraft was categorized less as a crime and more as a laughable mistake. A superstition. Something priests were supposed to correct, like scolding a congregation for believing thunder was caused by giants bowling in the sky. But of course, people still whispered. The villagers might not agree with the official clerical shrug, because to them, that old woman muttering over her cauldron seemed genuinely threatening, especially if your cow died the week after she glared at it. And so, informal punishments occurred. A suspected witch might be shunned, pelted with mud, or chased from the village. The community didn't need the church's blessing to be paranoid. Yet, crucially, this was not systematic, not organized, not the mass frenzy we imagine. It was occasional, local, and often as much about gossip as it was about religion. As we drift along to the 12th century, things begin to shift. Scholars began to rediscover ancient texts. Translations of Arabic and Greek works flooded into Europe, and with them came new ideas about demons, spirits, and the power of magic. What had once been dismissed as harmless nonsense began to look more sinister. Learned men, sitting in Camelot libraries, began muttering that maybe, just maybe, those women weren't merely deluded. Maybe they really were consorting with demons. And naturally, once the intellectuals got involved, everything became more complicated. By the late Middle Ages, the gentle tolerance had begun to erode. Witches were now suspected of more than just herbs and charms. They were rumored to hold secret gatherings, to worship dark powers, to poison wells. Still, the great witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries were yet to come. But in this earlier period, the witch was still liminal, suspicious, but not yet the stuff of nightmares. A creature hovering between healer and outcast, simultaneously valued and feared. So to answer the question, how were witches treated before witch trials became popular? The answer is inconsistently. They were scolded, tolerated, fined, shunned, hired, admired, mocked, and occasionally punished, but rarely burned. For centuries, the idea of killing a witch in great numbers simply wasn't on the table. It took time, paranoia, and the careful work of theologians with too much spare time to escalate things into the inferno that would later sweep across Europe. But that, perhaps, is a story for another night. And for now, we'll let this first chapter of our quiet journey close. Imagine the dim glow of a medieval hearth, an old woman whispering to herself in the corner, her neighbors suspicious, but not yet murderous. The room smells faintly of herbs and damp straw. Outside, the night is calm, and history for the moment is resting.